All right, so today we're going to try to run through Chapter 11 really, really quickly, talk about personal security, a few things. Thursday, you're going to be set at the back row, hiding from the world, and your task in 70 minutes will be to destroy a computer. So think about between now and then what websites you think would be horrible to go to. What kind of things could you download? So, and immediately that's what comes to mind, and we'll show you that, well, I don't care that you go there because I'm not going to look, but there may be even worse things you can go to. So one of them that I see a lot are toolbars. I see toolbars and I see screensavers, and people will download these for different holiday events. So Easter screensavers that just came by, fall screensavers, and what they usually come bundled with is a ton of extra malware. So we're going to do a quick little piece about malware and some different things, and we're going to then Thursday try to infest machines for an entire hour. So we're going to look at staffing and how do we find people, and do we pay them? How does this happen that we get all these things in there? So of those people that are security professionals, some of these numbers are kind of interesting. So less than 4% were unemployed. So the national unemployment rate, depending on how we look at it, is 6 to 8% nationally. So it's literally half the unemployment rate for those people in the security industry. And in fact, if you're really good at it, what do you think the unemployment rate is? It's your choice in a lot of cases. So sometimes people will choose to work as contingent workers. In other words, they'll take a 9-month contract and then loaf for 3 more months. Maybe not loaf, but research their skills or something else. So a lot of people in the security business change jobs, and in some cases that's personal preference. It's not necessarily a company organization. So how do we go about finding people to look at for these kinds of jobs? So whether we're a small company, we need to hire somebody with a jack of all trades, or if we're a large company, we need to hire somebody for a security management position. So one thing we need to know is understand, because I assume most of us are going into general management versus IT management, and in a lot of cases we need to know then what kind of things do we look for. So we need to look at how are our companies structured, what kind of people do we want. And one of the things that we really find is it's very easy to hire somebody who's very, very technically skilled. The problem comes in a lot of cases, those soft skills. In other words, how can they interact and deal with non-geeky people, if we want to use that term? How do they deal with people who don't understand all these technical terms? And those people that have both those very, very technical skills and the ability to communicate to lay people can make a huge amount of money. So even around here, so Cooper, for example, out at the nuclear plant, hires in companies that come in and do security. Those guys coming in and doing that are probably at a minimum of $150,000 a year. So there's a lot of money in it. But again, it's that idea that how do we relate back to ordinary people and get that information disseminated? And how do we apply these terms? Now, there are people that have security information jobs that lose them due to other issues. So what do you think happened to corporate security people at Target, for example? Did they lose their job? Very possible. It's very, very possible that those kinds of things happen. So one of the things that we need to do when we establish these jobs, or we look at, or for a job, is we need to look at what kind of expectations. So a typical hierarchy, and this can vary from industry to industry. So we'll have a chief information officer above all of this, and then we have the security officer. So usually sits right below the CIO. We may have a consultant that comes in and does work on the side, and consultants can do a lot of things that full-time employees can't. And one of those things they can do is they can ruffle feathers because they're there temporarily. So they can say things that we as a full-time employee wouldn't be allowed to say. Then we'll have a manager, and then we'll have various people that are on the very technical side. So security administrator, security technician, we may even have security officers. So Chief Information Officer, one of the certificates that they need to have in a lot of businesses is something called the CISSP. And if you'll look at the assignment that's in the discussion board this week, there is a very quick sample of some of the questions that you would see on that CISSP. So that's the most common one. CISM certificates are common. The other thing that's really common is they don't have any security credentials, which is odd. They either have a whole ton of credentials or they have literally none because of their experience in the industry. So it's kind of an odd mix of those. So, Chief Information Security Officer. So a lot of times they're working with things like credibility, they work with business engagement, they work with sustainability of that department, relationship management. In other words, how do I manage those relationships between different corporate environments? How do I externally manage relationships? So underneath them is a security manager, and so you think of it as a continuum. Top level is, if you want to think of it in terms of paper, and then a mix of paper, and then hands-on applications, if you want to think of it in those terms. So the security manager then is the day-to-day person. So in some cases you may have multiple security managers in a very large corporation. So these people work with other departments, they have specific tasks, and they then will then report to that security. Go, little mouse. Go, there we go. So oftentimes they're involved in planning, so they will be a lot of times be assigned to all kinds of teams. In a lot of cases they're cross-functional teams, so it will not just be a team in one particular department or another, it'll be a cross-functional team. So they will also do contract reviews, whatever they can do. So our book has huge lists of these, so please make sure you're reviewed and looked at what somebody like a security manager would do. So in theory, most people will have a CISSP or other certificate, but they also probably will need some experience, some certificates perhaps in budgeting, project management, how to hire personnel, the always horrible hiring and firing process. And I don't know in some cases which is worse, hiring or firing people, because both of them will expend a huge amount of your resources to deal with them. So a lot of times they will draft policies, but generally the day-to-day, not overarching company-wide policies, standards, guidelines. Underneath them, then we generally have people like security technicians. So these are the very hands-on people, those that work with the firewalls. They may work with intrusion detection systems, problem shooting. In a lot of cases, these people are oftentimes the entire IT group at a company. So they may assign the role of a security technician, but they may also do desktop troubleshooting, network troubleshooting, and other tasks. Okay, mouse. So, depends on the company, what the software. They may have some certificates. They may have like a Security Plus certificate from TIA. It depends on the particular job and what we're looking for at them. Are they a general purpose? Do we need them for other tasks? Seriously, mouse. Okay, so there's a ton of other titles that would land under there. So generally, anybody in information technology is going to be on that technician, that security role at least. So one of the things we do is, how do we determine what your value is as an employee? Well, obviously we have to look at the idea of return on investment. We want you to generate more in revenue for me than what you cost me in salary and benefits. But is an IT department in most companies a revenue generating center? No, it's a cost center. So it becomes even harder for us to match that idea of what your value is to your outcome. Now, If somebody had been able to stop the Target invasion, so Sydney got to work for Target, you stopped the Target data breach, you saved him hundreds of millions of dollars. You'd probably make $1 million that year, right? Yeah, hopefully. So we have to match. How do we get them to match those levels? So there's a lot of different certificates. And so what I'm asking you guys to look at is a 20 sample question of the CISSP. There's all different kinds of ones. So BrainBench, we don't even mention in here, has some certificates. There's all different kinds. And so as an employer, when I try to hire somebody, we struggle a little bit to try to see if these things match. And there are some older certificates. So for example, the old A+ certificate from TIA, sorry, not my retirement, TIA. But the issue with that one was you could have gotten that A+ certificate in 1999. You never had to renew it. It had no continuing renewal process. So is somebody working with desktop computers and the skills from 1999 or 2000 relevant to today? It's a little different. Hopefully they've adapted, but sometimes you run into people that couldn't. So some of these now have got experience requirements in them. They have continual renewal. In other words, you have to set for so many hours of classroom, and in some cases you have to retake an exam. So for this particular one, you have to have at least 5 years of direct security experience or 4 years and a college degree. And so a lot of them will do that. They'll substitute a college degree for a certain number of hours. That gives it some caveat and some, they think that the college degree is worth something. Now, it scares me a little bit that it's worth 1 year according to their experience, but you'll see that in a lot of places that they do that. So there's all different kinds of exams inside of that CISSP. So unfortunately, it's not when you sit down and you do it in an hour. The entire exam, I believe, will take you at least 8 hours of full-time taking to do it, and it's broken down into pieces. So you want to look at inside of there. There's cryptography. There's InfoSec governance, legal operations, security, physical security, telecom security, networking. So usually people that take the CISSP have been involved, in a lot of different faucets, and they've got other certificates behind them also. So they may have a Network Plus certificate, they may have a Security Plus, all different kinds of security certificates before this, because this is kind of an overarching one. So there's some informational pieces there, and then you can actually go beyond this one and get a certificate in an advanced concentration area. So I'm trying to hire somebody, and I need to know if those certificates are valid. So there's also one called an SSCP, which is really more of the hands-on. So it deals with less legal issues and more with things like malicious codes, networks, risk responses, security, in terms of operational issues. So if I'm hiring a security technician, maybe an SSCP. And quite frankly, if I have somebody with a CISSP applying for a security technician issue problem, I'm probably going to look at them a little weird and go, well, you've got a $100,000 degree certificate. Why are you applying for a $25,000 job? So there is a life cycle in now, a software life cycle. So this one is those programmers and those people looking at secure programming environments. So if you're a software developer, you need to hire one. This might be something you want to look at, because if you look at some of the open holes, and including like Heartbleed, could current practices have possibly prevented that? They now also offer something called the Associate of Degrees or certificates. So in other words, you can take the exam as you're working towards getting your 4 years or 5 years of experience. So it's kind of like the CPA. I can go set for the CPA exam, but if I don't have the necessary hours of practice, I can't become an actual CPA. I can say that I passed the CPA, but I'm not a licensed CPA, if that makes any sense. So IASCA has some certificates. There's a lot of different organizations out there. So the CISM covers kind of the overarching, more the managerial roles. But notice they actually require continuing education. And again, we have a 5-year requirement for this particular certificate. So when I start to hire people, I look at these certificates and I go, well, what is the value of that certificate? Is it one that requires, as the CISA does, 20 contact hours of continuing education or others? Do I have to pay and maintain it? And in some cases, some of these, again, you have to retake exams. Because as things change, we want to maintain our skills and be current. So, governance of IT. So, this one, though, only says you have to have 1 year experience. So if I look at them and I look, well, this sounds like it covers a lot of the same things that the CISSP covers, but if we don't know the differences in the certificates, and certainly it's something we'd want to research when we started hiring people, the CRISCK, there's tons of these different. The SANS Institute also then has a ton of certificates. Again, I mentioned Brain Bench is another one. One of the issues with all of these certificates, so CompTIA has a Security Plus. One of the issues with all of these is, are they susceptible to the idea of boot camps? And so there are some certificates that used to be very, very valuable in the workplace. If you had a Microsoft Certified Systems Engineer certificate, it was nearly an open ticket 10 years ago to get a $100,000 a year job based on your certificate alone. But what happened is people started realizing, well, this test takes a long time to pass. It's very detailed. But what I can do is do a 2-week boot camp. And I can force feed you information only towards taking the test for 2 weeks, and I can get 70 or 80% of the people to pass. So they have the skills necessary to pass the exam, but weren't necessarily able to deal with real life and IT, and anything outside of that closed loop of that test they had issues with. And so we have to be careful of those. CompTIA, we actually model our networking class after a certificate from CompTIA called the Network Plus. So I like some of the CompTIA certificates. To apply for one, most of these certificates, at least on the entry level, you can simply pay, register, and go down to any Prometric test center. The Security Plus one is no example. $255, you can go down, register, and take it. So it covers a lot of very wide skill sets. So communications, access controls, external, operational issues. It's a very good general purpose certificate. If you would like to go out and get one, this might be one to start on that road to getting certificates. The CompTIA ones tend to be a little more affordable than some of the other ones, and there's some really, really good training materials out there. At several organizations, we've used the CompTIAs as a method to make sure that employees had the prerequisite skills that we wanted. So we would say, you know, we'll hire Kimberly, but within 6 months, you need to obtain the Security Plus certificate. And we would give you training materials, and we would even pay for you to go down and take the test. And so that's one thing we can certainly do. Now, does it mean that it's a perfect test? No. It's just one that I've had a little more experience with, and I've utilized in the past to try to get employees skilled, because any kind of training we do for employees is always good. Or at least we hope so. So, if you look at this in terms of percentages, you'll notice that cryptography is a very minor percent, network security is a large percent, threats, vulnerabilities. So that's how they've broken down their security exam. There's also this International Society of Forensic Computers. So if I want to go to work for the FBI or work in a crime lab, and I hate to break it to people that are watching NCIS and some of these other shows. These guys in the crime lab don't do everything from DNA testing to computer forensics. So generally, the computer guys are doing the computer stuff, the biologists are doing the biology. So there's a couple of things that for this I think are interesting. So one, you can't get to their exam if you have any criminal record. Now, there's exceptions, misdemeanors generally. So if you got an MIP in college, you'll probably be able to get through there. But, you know, if you hacked somebody up and threw them in a wood chipper and then got out after 20 years in the pen, probably not going to be able to pass this one. So you actually have some tests. So some of these tests are now becoming more interesting in terms of they're not just a simulation even online. They actually require you to do real physical work. What's different though is what those cost, and so sometimes those tests where we have actually staged events certainly cost more. And so then as you progress up, you can eventually become a master certified computer examiner. So documentation for some of these is interesting in terms of how do I document for the number of hours. And so if I've worked for an employer that went out of business, I've known some people that tried to step for a professional management certificate or a project management certificate. They work for employers that are out of business. It's very hard for them to document those hours, and they've had issues with that. So sometimes if you're going to start setting for these, you want to document every year with your employer just for that hands-on purposes. So some of the certificates are literally thousands of dollars by the time you get them. So they have multiple parts. So even the A+ certificate has 2 parts, so it's $500 essentially to take that. Something like the Microsoft Certified System Engineer is in 15 parts at $250 a piece or something. So they can be very expensive. And again, I want you to take any kind of these certificates though with a little bit of a grain of salt. Are they legitimate? So we all know how to prep for testing. What we want to look at is that idea of human resources, hiring, firing, managing, because we're in kind of a unique position. If I hire the guy taking out the trash, they're not in a position to cause any real damage to my company at this point. However, if I'm going to fire the director of IT at my casino, for example, are there issues that could happen? If he knows that he's been targeted or going to be fired, could he have written a piece of code that every day he has to sign in or it'll wipe out every drive in our system? It's possible. So we have to be very careful about that. And so hiring, well, we want to make that job description as good as possible, but one of the issues is, even in an interview, I want to hire somebody to be my director of security. Do I show them every piece of my IT and my computer network and everything else during an interview? And in fact, it's become known that sometimes now individuals have used job interviews as a way to obtain enough information to go back in and do either some kind of a phishing attack or a social interaction attack, because we gave them all this information and we want to be very helpful, and so we even recognize that name. So you have to be a little careful sometimes about things like in your interviews, how much information you feed back to a candidate. Isn't that a scary world? But it's happened. We don't want to give them the keys to the castle. And in fact, even when we hire them, we have to be careful for a while. So orientation, and almost all employees now at most companies have some kind of an information security briefing on top of the normal briefing about HR policies. You have to wear pants to work, you can't give out your passwords, all these kinds of things. And then we want to think about, for all of our employees, on-the-job training. So a lot of companies have instituted a once a year or once every quarter or once every 6 months job fairs. And what we want to do is continually reinforce to people that security is an issue. And let them know that if if you see something you think is wrong, so you're at that HVAC control company that managed to allow your servers to get targeted that eventually led to Target, should somebody at that company have known, hey, we're using the same passwords for every one of our clients? And we want to think that people know better. So we want to keep that idea of information security relevant to everybody. And then when we hire them. So this is becoming an idea, this idea of background checks is becoming more and more common. In fact, even here at our own college, we're going through a revision of our background check process. So a couple of things that will throw out there. It wasn't that long ago we had a president at our college who it turns out spent 9 months in jail that nobody knew anything about. Not our current president, but many, many years ago we had one. So we didn't do background checks on a lot of administrative staff when they got hired. So now we do background checks on everybody, including if you're working with students as a student, we have to background check you in a lot of cases. So RAs at the residence dorms and other things are going to get background checks. Your coaches all get background checks. And it shows up a lot of different things. We look at things like motor vehicle records. We certainly look up, have you been arrested and been in prison? We may verify previous employment history. We may look at education. So there's been a lot of cases where people have gotten a job based on essentially lying on a resume and saying, you know what, I want to apply for this job. It says I need a master's degree. I'll just make up a college and put a master's degree down because they're never going to check. Well, unfortunately now they do. We may also look at workers' compensation history. And this one bothers me a little bit. So, what do I pick on? Let's pick on Dustin. So, Dustin's gotten injured at a previous job through no fault of his own, but spent a year and a half in a rehab hospital because we dropped something on him and his back was torn out. Well, I can see where we'd say, we don't want to hire somebody because of that issue, but the reality is I think it can also be unfair. I think we have a kind of a slippery slope there. There was an employer not too long ago, Burlington Northern Santa Fe Pacific Railroads, wanted to do genetic tests of all of their employees before they were hired because they wanted to screen them for things that they could detect. So things like multiple sclerosis or something like that. And they would say, Sydney, we're not going to hire you because you have a chance of developing this disease in the future. And that's probably not really fair. And in fact, it went to court. So we have to be a little careful in our background checks. So we want to be as secure as possible, but we also want to be fair to potential employees. So we may also look at drug history, medical history, credit history. So if we have somebody that's doing data entry for credit card information, do we want somebody who's filed bankruptcy 6 times in the last 12 years? Probably not. And in fact, we'd probably have some issues with that. Now, medical history, again, there's some legal issues with that. But if somebody has a history of not taking their psychiatric meds and running around the room with a stapler, we want to be careful with it. So HR generally gets updated about federal regulations, so you'll have to work with them in terms of what we can even ask in terms of that background investigation. So how do we deal with those issues? You're going to see more and more background investigations. So almost anything we do now. So if I want to go to work and become a big brother, big sister somewhere, you'll have to submit to a background investigation. And it's usually pretty painless. They'll take your fingerprints, they run them against your name. And however, occasionally things show up that are weird. One of them, when I did a background investigation when we were doing foster care, was all of a sudden it showed up on a credit report, and I hadn't pulled my credit report, that I had had a vehicle repossessed. Well, what? I didn't have a 1977 Cadillac or whatever this thing was. looked, and then it showed up that there were some medical bills that weren't unpaid for this guy's spouse, who he apparently had a history of apparently not treating very well. When they end up in the hospital, that's generally a bad sign. Well, it turns out they had a very similar name, and their social security number was only a couple digits off, and they lived about 50 miles from where I grew up. And so getting that back off of there was a little bit of a problem, and I had to sign all kinds of affidavits and all kinds of things. So I did not put Teresa Griffin or whoever her name was in the hospital. It was not me. So we have had issues here where we have hired an employee and then had to tell them no because of the background check. We weren't able to hire you. So what about non-compete clauses, non-disclosure agreements? So one of the things that happens, we hire you for a security job, is we'll a lot of times, or even an IT job, or almost any job, we make you sign a contract saying, whatever information you got at this company, you're not taking it with you. If you leave, you can, in a lot of cases, they will make you sign a non-compete for a number of years. After you leave, you cannot work within a certain radius doing certain kinds of jobs. Some of those have proven to be very hard to enforce. But you're starting to see that more and more. Employees want to have as much control over you as possible. They may try to control your use of social media. So part of your pre-employment contract may be that you agree that if you use social media, that you will not put out material detrimental in any way to the company. And that includes things like posting, I hate my job. Unfortunately, I have a nephew who learned that lesson the hard way. He started posting on Facebook that, man, my job really sucks. I don't like it here at this car dealership. I want to go somewhere else. I'm going to go to St. Joe and look for a job, blah, blah, blah. Well, his boss, he had friended on Facebook on top of that to make life more fun, walked in and said, you know, you wanted to go apply at St. Joe for a dealership job. You have a lot of free time to do that because you're fired as of today. So it's in that employee contract, and employers have a vested interest. We don't want people bad-mouthing our company, whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent. So a lot of times we add into a renewal clause something about information security. So our performance evaluations, and we try now to look at performance evaluations for employees and try to evaluate them on as many areas as possible. So we might talk about information security. We might talk about job performance. We might even look at, are you tardy for work every day? All of those items we look at. In a lot of cases, you're not allowed to get a salary increase unless you get a certain score on a job performance scale. And so if, you're the one up there that we constantly have to say, take the Post-it notes down that have your password, it's going to be an issue. So even worse then, we figured out we needed to hire you, and now, for whatever reason, we're going to have to fire Kimberly. I'm always firing. It is kind of true. I fire you a lot, don't I? So what kind of things? We need to make sure that we have it very well documented what we're going to do in terms of making a person no longer part of our company. And it's a horrible process. So we need to get them out of our system, and we need to do it in a timely manner. Now, sadly, one of the times that sometimes people get an idea that something's wrong with their job and that they're about to be fired is they try to get on their email or get into the company network and, hey, I'm not allowed to. Why are there people walking towards my office with boxes in their hand? So how do we get materials back? And so that's an issue with, in a lot of cases, companies give you a laptop. If I come in and I say, no, I'm not going to fire. I'll say, well, Alex, you're fired, but you need to come in and bring that laptop we gave you tomorrow. What are you going to do? Yeah, you're going to back up your own stuff, and hopefully we'll bring it back. So we may have to schedule, and in that pre-employment contract, you may have something about liquidated damages. Say you come in and you go, well, I'm just going to punch this computer repeatedly until it's broken. sometimes we have to deal with that issue. And in some cases, we simply say, you know what? It's a $500 laptop. We're going to remotely wipe it because we have software to do that. And Merry Christmas, it's yours now. And because quite frankly, it's not worth the effort to go back and retrieve that. We do that with a lot of equipment. It's quite frankly, it's a time to upgrade anyway. So we usually will take their data, so their hard drive, if they're saving on a server, and we archive that off. So if we have an issue in the future, because now, okay, we'll go back to you, Kimberly. So we fired Kimberly. She's now very mad because she got fired, and she says, you know, that Mr. Griffin fired me because I'm a woman. And so now he's filing a lawsuit against me and the company. Or she says, you know, you fired me because of my age, because I'm 62. I'm 22, sorry. So if we have an age discrimination or other lawsuit, so we need to usually keep a copy of that. So a lot of companies, what we do is we have a very quick process where when we fire somebody, we take all their documents and we send them over to HR. So one thing that gets that out of our hand, and usually they're the ones that are able to handle that. So we maybe make a DVD of all their emails for the last year or 2 years or whatever our retention policy is. So what if we get sued, we can have that. We need to make sure that they don't have a door key, or if we have a passcard system or other system that they are now locked out of it. We need to get them and their stuff out. And I know it sounds really cruel to escort people out that way, but the reality is it sometimes prevents situations, both good, bad, and different. We really don't want somebody hanging around for, you know, a week after we told them they're fired. Even if somebody is terminating their agreement at will, so in other words, Alex comes to me and he says, you know, I'm going to quit, and I'm giving you my 30 days notice, because in a lot of professional organizations, it requires 30 days. We may actually sit down as your boss, and we may say, you know what, I know you're leaving in 30 days. Let's see if we can do a debriefing this week, and we'll get you out of here early and pay you that extra till the end of that time. And that actually happens quite a bit, because what's happening? Alex knows he's going to another job. Does he really, A, care about his job at this point? No. And B, if he's going to a competitor, do we want him to have a chance? And I'm not saying he would, but sometimes we don't understand what people are going to be up to. We don't want him to make a company list of all of our employees for targeting later, their vendors, and those kinds of things. So in a lot of cases, we'll let people out of their contract early. And for most executive level positions or anything above that basic data entry person, we'll pay them the remainder of that. So if our company requests 2 weeks, we may give them a 2-day debriefing and say, you know, you're out of here. We'll let you out early. Now, the other thing we need to do, though, is we need to get all the information back out of Alex or whoever we're firing that only he knows. Now, hopefully we've not developed a situation where he's the only one that knows the passwords to our system, but it sometimes happens, and so we need to make sure that we get all their information back. So hopefully we can do this on a friendly basis, but the reality is terminations are ugly. There's no other way to put it. And so are there better ways to handle it? The worst example of anybody being fired I ever heard of was, you guys have heard of the Radio Shack Tandy Corporation? You may even have seen, although they're diminishing and they're kind of out of scale now, the Radio Shack stores. Well, their corporate headquarters down in Fort Worth, Texas, decided to lay off several hundred employees, and they sent them an email saying you're going to be laid off. How would you like to come back from lunch and see that email on your desk? So even worse, some of the employees, because when they did follow some of this, they removed access, they got back and they just couldn't get into their email. They didn't even know they were fired, so it almost was like something out of Office Space. So generally, you want to handle all of your termination issues face-to-face. I don't ever want to, have to send an email to Sydney and say, Sydney, it's just not working out. We're out of here. And meanwhile, I'm sitting in Tahiti while you're in your office. We don't want to do that. It does have to be a personal thing. So when we design these job tests, we have to think about how we hire and we fire people. So a lot of times we look at it in terms of how do we separate duties so that more than one individual has to be there to complete it so that we can look over each other's shoulders. In other words, if I'm doing payroll, I don't want to be the only person doing payroll, because if I'm the only one doing payroll, suddenly all of my illegitimate children that I don't even know about with made-up Social Security numbers are on the payroll getting checks. And I'm the one that, hasn't been there. I haven't taken a day off in 12 years, and I can cover that. So sometimes we even do some interesting things with jobs in terms of this separation of duties and requiring more than one person. But I'll walk in and say, Kimberly, you've been doing such a good job. We're going to give you an extra week off today, out of the office. Hand your keys to your assistant, whatever. What that does, although that seems like a very nice thing to start with, what that allows us to do is we can catch those kinds of things that you've been able to cover. So kiting checks or something else, if you were embezzling money, we'll be able to catch some of those. And so sometimes we'll do those kinds of techniques, or we'll rotate job positions. So the person doing HR and the payroll for a month a year gets rotated into the stocking office, and somebody else has to do that job. And we'll catch those things in a lot of cases that we've not caught up. But we really do want to build in those kinds of details into our job. We never want to have a job where one person is responsible for everything and holds our company hostage. Even if those employees are the owners, sometimes it can be hard. So job rotation, or we rotate tasks, vacation policies. So we require employees to take vacation. And there's a lot of different reasons that that's really good. Have you ever worked with somebody who hasn't had a vacation day in weeks, or they haven't taken a vacation week in years? Do you really want to work with them? No. So sometimes we need to get out of there, recharge our batteries. And it's even worse in today's society, because what are we all hooked to? Our phones, the internet, our email. So even when I take a vacation week, am I really off work? No. But we try to figure out some plans that we can do that. And so sometimes we will say, you know what, we're going to halt your email for a week. How do we get those kinds of details? And that way we can also catch, like I said, if you're doing anything horrible like kiting checks on the company. And you'd think that that is uncommon, but the reality is it's far more common than what you would like to think. And every week we'll see something in the paper about, well, this nun at the church in Omaha was going to the casino twice a week and stole $200,000. And so people you wouldn't even think about become involved in these kinds of things. So we do have details that we need to secure, and depending on what kind of an organization we are. So here as a school, we're required to secure a lot of our information. So your IDs and all those kinds of things, Social Security numbers, medical conditions. And in fact, as we speak about schools, if you look in the newspaper, you'll see that in Iowa, they just had a college university get 30,000 some student records broken into again this week. But what was interesting was somebody inside the system had to have some access, because what they were trying to use a server for was to generate cyber coins. And that's how the system became vulnerable. So, again, we have to secure all this information. And that extends out not just our employees, but every one of our students. We have to secure those. If we're a medical practice, we have to secure those. Those business relationships we've developed, we need to secure that. If we hire temporary workers, we are bound by the contracts with that temp agency, and sometimes we have issues with it. We want to have a non-compete clause or something else. It's very hard to deal with this idea. So sometimes we are very limited in what we can use a temporary worker for, or even a contract employee. So it depends on what we hire. In general, if you're going to work for 6 months for me, are you as dedicated to my company and my organization as somebody who's been there 10 years? Probably not. We bring in consultants, and that's pretty freely done. but usually they have to sign all kinds of contracts. So non-disclosure of information, non-compete clauses. They usually will have to be licensed and bonded depending on what they're doing. So in other words, if I sell my services as Acme Security and I go into a company and I actually cause issues, I may have to have a security bond that will cover $100,000 or whatever it is. Business partners, so in other words, if there's two hospitals working together, how they share that information, we need to work out very closely what they're going to share and what they're not going to share, and how to protect each other. So hiring and firing is tough. It's a very, very tough business. It can consume a tremendous amount of time. So one of the hiring processes I got involved with, and it's been now 3 years ago, was we were looking for, in Falls City, I did some work with the hospital, looking for a IT manager. Wanted somebody with some credentials. We wanted a master's degree, hopefully in healthcare governance, with IT also, because they were going to do more managerial roles. And they had some other specific requirements. And they had to be willing to work in a small town. And so one of the things we found as soon as we advertised nationally is you'd talk to somebody on the phone, they'd sound really good, and then you say, well, and you have to live in Falls City, and they go, well, where's Falls City? And as soon as they would do a Google search, which you'd think they would do that ahead of time, and they would go, oh, no way. I'm not living in a town of 5,000 people. We have the same issue when we have people apply for jobs here at our college. You can almost see them sometimes if you get lucky enough to pick one up at the airport in Omaha, and you start driving out here towards the cornfields, and they just go, there's a college? We're in the middle of nowhere. And so some of these people, the most memorable one I was involved in was a hiring committee where this potential professor brought his wife, and she literally cried the entire time they were here. Actually, they were back east and much more. Had he even been, yeah, it was very sad. So again, that hiring process is pretty tough. How do we find the right candidate for the job? How do we then keep them there? And then how do we deal with it when they leave? Because unfortunately in IT, people tend to move a lot from job to job. And so when I'm looking at people for an IT job, I don't get too concerned when they've been 3 or 4 years here and 3 or 4 years somewhere else. That's fairly common. There's other positions that that's not as common for. And so sometimes in that hiring process, we need to know what our expectations are. And there can be some real advantages in information security with people that do move from corporation to corporation. So we'll pick on Sydney. You look like you were yawning, so we're going to have to. So Sydney's now had 10 different jobs in 10 years. But you know what? When she comes into my company, she brings all that experience from 10 different organizations. So she may see things differently than somebody who's been employed by us for 10 years straight. Because if I'm employed there, I think I know that everything I do is right. I'm the best at what I do, right? Sydney's, sure you are, because my grade depends on. No, I would never do that. But if I'm there, I get complacent about I think, I know everything, I do everything. Sydney comes in and goes, I was at XYZ Corporation and they did this and it seemed like it might work better. And so we get that mix of ideas. And so sometimes that's not a very, very, very bad thing at all. So we talk about all these certifications and everything, like every company's a Fortune 500 one. And that's one of the issues that you're going to run into. Not every company is a Fortune 500 company. And so in a smaller corporation, 50 people, 25 people, you're going to assume a lot of those different roles. And so how we do things like job separation in a very small company becomes tough. And we have to deal with those issues. So how we hire and fire is probably one of the most painful processes, but it can also be one of the most rewarding. All right, so very quickly, if you look ahead to week 16, the quiz is not available. However, your final project is. So in week 16, due on Thursday, May 8th, is a 100-point paper with one of two topics. So there are two topics. So it can be either heartbleed or it can be target. And both of those, if you go back through our discussion board, we have a lot of resources that people have already identified. This is a little different because one of the things you're going to do, you are going to write it in APA, so 5 to 7 pages is double spaced. APA is great. APA is good. See, so 5 to 7. So 5 to 7 pages. APA, 5 to 7 does not include ancillary material, so like title pages. Yes, you have. So, a couple of other things on there. If you'll notice, you're writing this in a little different. We are writing it as though you are writing a journal article or in some kind of a magazine. So, we are tentatively calling it the Peru State Times Computer Gazette. So, if you have an alternative idea, you are welcome to submit those via email to me. However, then you won't have that wealth of already existing resources to go try to find. So 8 sources minimum, which should be fairly easy. It is not an English class because you're being forced to do a little research. It's not that difficult. So you have until that Thursday. Now, one thing to remember, there's something else due that week, and there's a lot of other classes you're probably involved in. So that date is also the date that the final quiz is due that opens up that week. So there is both a final. There's a final quiz and a paper due that week. With a test/quiz, whatever you want to call it. But we will. No, you have a project and a final. But they together. So if you can think of this paper as your take-home portion of the final. So 5 pages, double-spaced, 12 points font is not that big. Well, APA is double-spaced, 12-point font, not triple-spaced and 34-point font. So